Hello friends, welcome to the session on learning. Friends, let me introduce you to the topic. Human behavior is caused and is highly unpredictable too. Why people behave as they behave has been a subject of much interest and concern. Understanding human behavior in an organization is of great importance to managers for managing people effectively. A study of organization behavior is incomplete without studying learning and attitude of people. If a manager wants to understand and predict behavior of people in organization, he or she needs to understand how learning occurs or how people learn. Friends, this session will focus upon the understanding the learning and the detailed understanding of learning theories. Now let's see what are the objectives of the session. Friends, at the end of the session, you will be able to understand the concept of learning, nature and features of learning, learning theories, comparison of theories, and application of theories in individual behavior. Let's see what is learning first. Friends, learning is a change in behavior as a result of experience. According to Stephen Robbins, learning is any relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs as a result of experience. Learning is a continuous process. It occurs all the time. It is any relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs as a result of experience. Learning is a change in behavior through education and training, practice and experience. Friends, learning may be described as the process of acquiring the ability to respond adequately to a situation which may or may not have been previously encountered as the favorable modification of response tendencies consequent upon previous experience, particularly the building of a new series of complex coordinated motor response. Let us understand the nature and features of learning. Friends, learning involves change, either good or bad. The change in behavior must be relatively permanent. Temporary changes will fail to represent any learning. Learning takes place when there is some change in actions, a change in individuals' thought processes or attitudes, but no change in behavior would not be learning. Learning occurs throughout one's life, and so it is a continuous process. Learning is a lifelong process. Friends, learning is determined by motive and stimulus. Now, the most important part of the session is learning theories. Let us try to understand one after the other. First is a classical conditioning theory. Friends, the classical conditioning theory was proposed by a Russian psychologist Ivan Pavlov. According to this theory, behavior is learned by a repetitive association between the response and the stimulus. The theory is based on that learning is developed through the interactions with the environment. It says that the environment shapes the behavior. Internal mental state such as thoughts, feelings, emotions do not explain the human behavior. As per the theory, organism learns to transfer response from one stimulus to a previously neutral stimulus. Friends, classical conditioning is comprised of 4 elements. First is unconditioned stimulus, which invariably causes to react in a way. Second is unconditioned response, that is, takes place when the unconditional stimulus is presented. Third is conditioned stimulus, that is, the object that does not bring about the desired response. Fourth is conditioned response, that is, a particular behavior that an organism learns to produce when the conditioned stimulus is presented. Friends, Pavlov conducted an experiment on a dog and measured the amount of saliva secreted by a dog with the use of a surgical procedure when it is exposed to different stimulus or object. At first, when Pavlov presented a piece of meat to the dog, he noticed a great amount of salivation, whereas in the second time when he just rang the bell, he observed there was no effect of bell on the dog's salivation. After this, Pavlov rang the bell accompanied with meat and noticed the salivation of a dog. He repeated this process several times and finally one day he just rang the bell without meat and observed that dog still salivated to the bell alone, which was originally a neutral stimulus. Thus, he found out that the dog has become classically conditioned to sound of the bell, and every time when he rings the bell, the dog salivates. Second is operant conditioning. The operant conditioning theory states that people are likely to emit responses that are rewarded and will not emit any response that are neither followed by any reward nor punishment. Thus, an individual tries to establish an association between a particular behavior and consequence. The operant conditioning theory is given by B. F. Skinner, who believed that behavior is voluntary and is determined, maintained and controlled by its consequences. According to him, one must focus on the external or observable causes of behavior rather than the internal mental events such as motivation, thoughts, feelings and so on. Friends, Skinner performed an experiment wherein the rat was placed in a glass box called a Skinner box. In that box, there were two levers, one attached to the feeding tube while the other produced the electric shock. The rat pressed the first lever attached to the tube and got the food to eat, but as soon as it pressed the other lever, it got a shock. A rat discovered from its action the lever which is rewarding and the one which gives a shock, that is a negative response, and pressed only that lever which resulted in food. Thus, Skinner observed that the rate of response as well as the change in the response was seen after the behavior was performed, not before. The operant conditioning is also called as an instrumental conditioning, which means learning is developed through the rewards and punishments given for a particular behavior. Friends, there are three elements that results in the development of a new behavior, that includes stimulus situation, behavioral response to the situation and consequence of a response. For example, while driving a car, we apply the brakes in order to avoid the accident. Thus, the possibility of an accident without the application of brakes is stimulus situation. The application of brake is the behavior and escape from the accident is the consequence of behavior. Thus, through this process, an organism learns to distinguish between the behaviors that are rewarding and try to engage them in those behaviors. Friends, the third theory is cognitive theory. Edward Tolman has contributed significantly to the cognitive learning theory. According to him, individuals not only respond to stimuli but also act on beliefs, thoughts, attitudes, feelings and strives towards goals. In other words, an individual creates a cognitive map in his mind, that is, an image of the external environment, preserves and organizes information gathered as a result of the consequences of events encountered during the learning process. Thus, the organism learns about the event and objects on the basis of a meaning assigned to stimuli. Tolman was the first behaviorist who challenged the conditional theory on the belief that stimulus response theory is unacceptable, as reinforcement was not necessary for the learning to happen, and asserted that behavior was mainly cognitive. He believed that the environment offers several experiences or cues which are used to develop the mental image, that is, cognitive map. Thus, cognitive learning theory is based on the cognitive model of human behavior, that is, it emphasizes on the free will and positive aspects of human behavior. Friends, cognition here refers to the individual's thoughts, feelings, ideas, knowledge and understanding about himself and the environment. Tolman has conducted an experiment to elucidate the cognitive learning theory. He trained a rat to turn right in the tea maze in order to obtain food. One day, he started a rat from the opposite part of the maze. According to the operant conditioning theory, the rat should have turned right due to the past conditioning, but instead it turned towards where the food was kept. Thus, Tolman concluded that rat formed a cognitive map in his mind to figure out where the food has been placed, and reinforcement was not a precondition for learning to take place. The next theory is a social learning theory. Friends, the social learning theory is given by Albert Bandura. Albert believed that individual learns behavior by observing the others. Simply by observing the other person's behavior, attitude and the outcome of that behavior, an individual learns how to behave in a given situation depending on the consequences observed. The social learning theory acts as a bridge between the behavioral and cognitive theory, as it emphasizes the integrative nature of cognitive, behavioral and environmental determinants. This means social learning theory agrees with some part of behavioral and some part of cognitive theories. Let's see the next important theory, that is reinforcement theory. The reinforcement theory is an outgrowth of the behaviorist school of psychology. It is also known as contingency theory. B. F. Skinner, 1974, propounded the reinforcement theory. It holds that by designing the environment properly, individuals can be motivated. Instead of considering internal factors like impressions, feelings, attitudes and other cognitive behavior, individuals are directed by what happens in the environment external to them. Skinner argued that the internal needs and drives of individuals can be ignored because people learn to exhibit certain behaviors based on what happens to them as a result of their behavior. Skinner states that work environment should be made suitable to individuals and that punishments actually leads to frustration and demotivation. Hence, the only way to motivate is to keep on making positive changes in the external environment of the organization. The basic principles of the theory are: reinforced behavior tends to be repeated. Reward is most effective than punishment. Feedback is necessary for improvement. Rewards should be given without delay, and rewards should be given for successive approximation of the desired. Friends, there are two types of reinforcement. First is positive and second is negative. Positive reinforcement results when the occurrence of a valued behavioral consequence has the effect of strengthening the probability of the behavior being repeated. The specific behavioral consequence is called reinforcer. An example of positive reinforcement might be a salesperson that exerts extra effort to meet a sales quota and is then rewarded with a bonus that is treated as a positive reinforcer. On the other hand, negative reinforcement results when an undesirable behavioral consequence is withheld, with the effect of strengthening the probability of the behavior being repeated. Friends, negative reinforcement is often confused with punishment, but they are not the same. Punishment attempts to decrease the probability of specific behaviors, while negative reinforcement attempts to increase desired behavior. An example of negative reinforcement might be a salesperson that exerts effort to increase sales in his or her sales territory, which is followed by a decision not to reassign the salesperson to an undesirable sales route, and that will act as a negative reinforcer. The administration of the negative reinforcer should make it more likely that the salesperson will continue to exert the necessary effort in the future. Friends, extinction is similar to punishment in that its purpose is to reduce unwanted behavior. The process of extinction begins when a valued behavioral consequence is withheld in order to decrease the probability that a learned behavior will continue. Over time, this is likely to result in the ceasing of that behavior. For example, if an employee is continually praised for the promptness in which he completes his work for several months but receives no praise in subsequent months for such behavior, his desirable behaviors may diminish. Thus, to avoid unwanted extinction, managers may have to continue to offer positive behavioral consequences. Now, let us see schedules of reinforcement. Friends, the timings of the behavioral consequences that follow a given behavior is called reinforcement schedule. Basically, there are two broad types of reinforcement schedules. First is a continuous and second is intermittent. Friends, if a behavior is reinforced each time it occurs, it is called continuous reinforcement. Research suggests that continuous reinforcement is the fastest way to establish new behaviors or to eliminate undesired behaviors. However, this type of reinforcement is generally not practical in an organizational setting. Therefore, intermittent schedules are usually employed. Intermittent reinforcement means that each instance of a desired behavior is not reinforced. There are at least 4 types of intermittent reinforcement schedules that involves fixed interval, fixed ratio, variable interval and variable ratio. Let us try to understand one after the other. Fixed interval schedules of reinforcement occur when desired behavior are reinforced after set periods of time. The simplest example of a fixed interval schedule is a weekly paycheck. A fixed interval schedule of reinforcement does not appear to be a particularly strong way to elicit desired behavior, and behavior learned in this way may be subject to rapid extinction. The fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement applies the reinforcer after a set number of occurrences of the desired behaviors. Variable interval reinforcement schedules are employed when desired behaviors are reinforced after varying periods of time. Examples of variable interval schedules would be spatial recognition for successful performance and promotions to higher level positions. These reinforcement schedule appears to elicit desired behavioral change, that is resistance to extinction. Friends, variable ratio schedule is when reward varies relative to the behavior of the individual. He is said to be reinforced on a variable ratio schedule. Salespeople on commission represent examples of such variable ratio schedule. Rewards is variable in relation to number of successful calls the salesperson makes. Now let me summarize the session. Friends, learning is described as the process of acquiring the ability to respond adequately to a situation which may or may not have been previously encountered as the favorable modification of response tendencies consequent upon previous exercises, particularly the building of a new series of complex coordinated mode response, the fixation of times in memory so that they can be recalled or organized, the process of acquiring insight in the situation. Friends, in this session, we have learned the concept of learning, its features, and importantly, the theories like classical conditioning, operant conditioning, cognitive theory, social learning theories, reinforcement theory, and so on. Hope you could understand well learning fundamentals of individual behavior.